This is Lesson 852, the Napoleonic Era, 1799 to 1815. Focus questions. How did Napoleon Bonaparte assume control of France and much of Europe? What factors led to Napoleon's downfall? And how did Napoleon's invasions of Spain and Portugal in 1807 during the Napoleonic Wars help bring about political changes in Latin America? So we'll touch particularly on Spain. Key concepts of the Napoleonic era: the Grand Empire, the Napoleonic Code, coup d'etat, the Continental System, and nationalism. And let's take just a minute to talk about what nationalism is, because it's going to be a big deal. Nationalism or nationalist feelings can be summed up in several ways. Nationalism is also not the same thing as patriotism. So, what are these nationalism feelings? One is the feeling that your ethnic group is entitled to have its own sovereign nation and government and its own sovereign state. That's one feeling of nationalism. A second one is that your country's interests should come before the interests of anyone else. You hear this with a lot of MAGA Republicans who will say, America first. That's nationalism. And then a third feeling about nationalism is twofold. Number one, it's the feeling that your nation is superior to other nations and that your nation has been exploited and taken advantage of by lesser peoples. All of those feelings come under this umbrella that we're going to call nationalism, and nationalism is going to become institutionalized in governments, and nationalism has the potential to be deadly dangerous. Napoleon, perhaps the last enlightened absolutist, maybe. He was from the Mediterranean island of Corsica, and this island had somewhat recently become French territory. It wasn't ethnically really a part of France. In fact, he grew up speaking Italian. He always spoke French with an accent. So he was an outsider from the very beginning. He had a large family, and he was a career military officer. He was specialized in artillery, and he rose in the ranks and actually became a military hero at a very young age. The coup d'etat. We're skipping a lot of information here about Napoleon's campaigns in Italy and in Egypt, and we're going straight to the heart. Napoleon ousted the Directory. The Directory was a 5-man executive committee, kind of like a 5-man president, that was running the French government and doing a bad job at it all the way around. And Napoleon also disbanded the National Convention at bayonet point. And the National Convention was the name of France's representative body that they had at that time. Of course, they've had numerous representative bodies with different names, as we know: the Estates General, the National Assembly, etc. Then Napoleon wrote a new constitution for France. He put it to a vote, and the French people endorsed Napoleon overwhelmingly. Napoleon, during his time in power, had numerous domestic accomplishments in his home country of France. For example, the Napoleonic Code. This new law code gave all males equality before the law, all males. And it secured the wealth and property of private people. We'll talk about women in a second. Napoleon finally negotiated a peace with the Catholic Church. The French Republic had attempted to de-Christianize all of France. The Directory had been very hostile to the Church, and this had alienated the Church. And the French people, a very Catholic people, wanted a leader who would heal the division between France and the Catholic Church, and Napoleon reconciled with the Catholic Church in the Concordat of 1801. Another domestic accomplishment was that Napoleon upheld all of the freedoms and all of the land that the peasants had gained in the French Revolution. Napoleon also had some domestic failures. He failed to support women's rights. He came from a large family himself. He saw the family as a kind of a tiny nation within a nation, and he believed that the husband and father should be the absolute ruler of the family, just as he himself was the absolute ruler of France. He also curtailed free speech and free press. He didn't think people needed those things. Napoleon had many foreign accomplishments as well. In 1799, Napoleon sent out peace overtures to all of France's enemies throughout Europe, and France had made a bunch during the French Revolution. He knew his overtures would be rejected, and they were, so he attacked all those countries, and he consistently won and took large amounts of territory, at least on land. He didn't do so well on water. He abolished serfdom. And serfdom, as we remember from last semester, was the oppression and bondage of the peasants by noble landlords. He abolished that wherever he encountered it, wherever he conquered. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, literally. Traditionally, the Pope would put a crown on you and crown you Emperor, but he negotiated with the Pope ahead of time to take the crown out of the Pope's hands and place it on his head himself. He really saw himself, though, as the emperor of all of Europe, and he began to forge what he called his Grand Empire. Here's what the Grand Empire looked like. It consisted of three parts. The first part was the core, and that was an expanded France itself, and that's the dark blue. The dark blue area you see here is France. And in fact, that island, that dark blue island right above the red one in the Mediterranean, that is the island of Corsica, where he was from. The next level was the satellites, the satellite states. And these were dependencies of France. For example, Spain and the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Italy in the north of Italy. And you see these in the light blue. Napoleon put his family members in charge of some of these satellite countries. Then you had the independent allies. These were nominally independent countries, but they knew to toe the line and do what Napoleon wanted. Napoleon and nationalism. We talked about what nationalism was at the beginning of this presentation. Well, Napoleon sparked strong feelings of nationalism wherever he went. First, because conquered peoples were impressed by how strong France had become through its own sense of national pride and unity and mission. But secondly, because Napoleon's heavy-handedness caused a lot of resentment wherever he conquered. Spain, for example, revolted against Napoleon's brother, whom Napoleon had put on the Spanish throne. Nationalism soon spread to European colonies in Latin America, and nationalism eventually led to wars of incredible destruction and violence. The Grand Empire and the Continental System. Napoleon wanted to invade Britain, and he formed the Grand Army for that purpose. But distracting Britain's powerful navy long enough for this Grand Army to make the dangerous and risky trip across the English Channel proved to be impossible. So Napoleon came up with what he called the Continental System, which was basically a huge blockade designed to starve Britain economically. Every port in Napoleon's Grand Empire was expected to refuse any and all British shipping. But Russia wouldn't cooperate with the blockade. Also, Britain's powerful navy had a lot of blockading power of its own. And Britain actually did more harm to France than France did to Britain. The Continental System ultimately failed in its objective to starve the British. And Napoleon began looking eastward for opportunities to use his Grand Army. The invasion of Russia, June 1812. Napoleon blamed Russian Tsar Alexander I for the failure of the Continental System, and he invaded Russia in order to punish him. Napoleon had an army of 600,000 men, and 1/3 of it was French. The rest of it was foreign soldiers whose countries he had conquered. But the cold Russian winter and starvation overtook Napoleon's Grand Army. 370,000 soldiers died, and another 200,000 were taken prisoner. And Napoleon made it back to France with a mere fraction of his Grand Army. At that point, Napoleon's allies and satellites, they took Napoleon's reduced strength as an opportunity to abandon him. Napoleon's first exile, April 1814. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed what was called the Quadruple Alliance. And this alliance was too powerful for France to defeat in Napoleon's reduced military condition after the failed invasion of Russia. So Napoleon had no choice but to abdicate, that is, step down from the throne. And the alliance exiled him on some very favorable terms. One, he got to keep his title. Next, he got to rule the Italian island of Elba, not just live there, but be in charge. And third, he got an allowance of 2 million francs per year. A great deal. But 8 months later, Napoleon snuck back into France and took it over again. And he quickly went back to restore his grand empire. The Battle of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Britain and Prussia scrambled to stop Napoleon a second time. They met Napoleon at Waterloo, a small town in Belgium. And the Battle of Waterloo was a gruesome, full-day, total bloodbath. The French had 25,000 dead and wounded, and the Allies had 23,000 dead and wounded. The British and the Prussians barely won. Defeated, Napoleon abdicated, this time for good. This time, Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, where he couldn't reach anybody. He died 6 years later.